Night draped over Dust Valley like a ragged shroud of fate, heavy with gloom and the stench of old blood. Along the main street, a few oil lamps flickered weakly, throwing broken shadows of sagging rooftops, while the wind carried the acrid scent of gunpowder from battles not yet forgotten. Stray dogs howled down the alleys, their cries rattling against warped wooden doors, making those inside tighten the bolts and hold their breath. Out of that silence, a figure emerged, a woman in a plain black dress, her face hidden beneath a mourning veil that had become her eternal mark. Folks called her the Black Veil Widow. Her husband, a humble farmer, had been killed in a skirmish 2 winters past. Since then, she drifted through town like a ghost, her purpose unknown, her presence unapproachable. Her steps pressed into the dust, each grain snapping like brittle bones beneath her boots. The desert night wrapped its chill around her tangled strands of hair slipping from beneath the veil. She walked straight, eyes hidden yet scanning every shadowed corner as if expecting the darkness itself to move. Dust Valley was small, but once outlaws claimed it, everything twisted. The church bell no longer rang. The schoolhouse stood abandoned on the hill, its windows shattered by storm and sand. Children were kept indoors at dusk, and grown men spoke little, as if the whole town awaited a hanging that never came. At the far end, the saloon still burned with lamplight. A banjo plucked out a hollow tune, laughter slurred from drunken throats, until the doors swung open. Sound died as though a hand had squeezed it to silence. The man who stepped out was none other than Cain Mercer, the most feared outlaw in the territory. He was broad and weathered, beard wild, eyes like steel-gray stone. His cracked leather coat bore stains of fresh blood, and in his lazy grip hung a Colt revolver, as if lives were worth no more than flies. Cain Mercer had robbed wagon trains, gunned down 3 deputies, air thick with smoke and iron. "They say you still carry your grudge," he murmured, eyes drilling through the thin cloth. "But grudges are only small games in a land like this." She tilted her head slightly. Beneath the veil, her hand clenched a worn, folded paper, creased and torn from years of hiding. Tonight, she had chosen to face the very man who had dragged her life into darkness. A strong gust shook the lamps, their light stuttering across Cain's hollowed eyes. Deep pits where shadows dwelled, and from under the black veil, her gaze burned. A strange fire forged of sorrow, fury, and something hidden, something yet untamed. Cain faltered for just a moment. Not from fear, but because the look in her eyes was wrong. It wasn't the gaze of prey. It was the glare of a hunter biding her time. No one in town knew why she stood before him that night. No one guessed that the storm within her had finally broken. They only saw a widow and an outlaw, locked in the dust like spirits summoned to destroy one another. Far off, hoofbeats rolled over the plain, the sheriff's patrol making its round. Cain glanced toward the sound, smirking with disdain. He leaned close, his breath hot against her ear. "They won't get here in time. It's just you and me." For an instant, the world held still. The dogs wailed, the wind tore her veil loose, and there she stood, unyielding. Tonight, the game of blood had begun. The hoofbeats of the night patrol faded like distant thunder, trailed by the clink of spurs and murmured commands. In the hush between gusts of wind, the widow lifted the folded paper beneath her veil to her chest, as if touching a vow written in blood. Cain Mercer tilted his head, those slate-colored eyes narrowing. He had seen wills, ransom notes, and death letters, but the way she clutched that paper, tight as her own breath, piqued his attention. Behind him, the saloon lamps sputtered out. The doors swung wide, spilling 3 masked men into the street like coiled snakes. A shotgun thundered, buckshot chewing the dust at the widow's heels. Cain spun, his Colt barking twice. One outlaw collapsed, another staggered, clutching his shoulder, and the third vanished into the dark alley like a fox with its paw in a trap. A scream cut through the air. Then silence closed in again, the town holding its breath. "They've raised the bounty on my head," Cain muttered, his voice gravel. "But gold ain't the only reason they're after me." "It's not just gold," the widow answered, her voice low as coal smoldering. "There are debts that want closing." The sheriff's patrol came at last, lanterns strung in a trembling line of light across the dust. At their head rode Deputy Colt, square-jawed, steady hand resting on his revolver. His gaze swept the street, lingered on the fresh corpse, then fixed on the woman in black. "Who is she, Mercer?" Colt growled. "And why does death follow you into every street?" Cain shrugged. The widow spoke instead. "I'm the one collecting a debt, and he," she tipped her head toward Cain, "is part of the reckoning." Colt scowled. "Outlaws don't bargain in Dust Valley. Drop your irons, both of you." Cain let his Colt dangle, its click echoing like mockery. But the widow's words cut sharper. "Deputy, you're chasing too long." Colt's face hardened. "Bounty hunter circling the stables. We fall back to the station." The widow cut in, voice sharp. "Not the station. The Silver Notch mine. Someone there knows Hart's roots." Colt hesitated, but her stare allowed no debate. He split his men, posted front and rear, then led them through the dead streets. Cain and the widow walked side by side, their shadows stretching long and thin. They passed the abandoned church. Wind moaned through its empty bell, a sound like a half-finished prayer. Cain glanced at her. "Your name?" "Ruth," she whispered. "But folks call me the Veil." "Ruth," he repeated, as though tasting salt on a dry tongue. "What did Hart take from you?" She gripped the paper. "He bought our farm debt with a forged contract. When my husband resisted, fire swallowed our barn, then bullets. They told me Cain Mercer pulled the trigger. I believed it, until I looked into your eyes tonight and saw the lie. Hart's accountant pulled the shot. The ink on this page, his fingerprints, betray him. I've carried it for 2 winters." Cain said nothing. For the first time, his iron gaze dropped to her worn hands, ink stains faint on her fingertips. He didn't apologize, only breathed, faint as sparks in ash. At the town's edge, the lanterns dimmed. Darkness thickened, spiced with sage and dry earth. From the graveyard rose a shrill whistle. The bounty men's call. Colt gestured sharp. The widow's hand found the grip of a hidden pistol. Cain tugged his hat low. They slipped into a cattle trail, stones crunching beneath their boots like gnashing teeth. An arrow whistled, thudding into a splintered post a handspan from Ruth's face. Colt hissed, "You! We need the name of the keeper, and the route for Hart's silver wagons." Hooves thundered in the gulch outside. Colt peered at the door. "They're here." The clerk swallowed, hand trembling. "If I speak, Hart will carve me alive." Ruth lifted her veil enough to show her eyes, tired yet unbroken, pain hardened into steel. "If you stay silent, your conscience will carve you deeper." Choose your death. His lips quivered. At last he scribbled 3 words on the margin. Ford, Devil's Creek, dawn. Then he snuffed the lamp. They'll move the coffers through Devil's Creek at sunrise. They think riding early keeps them safe. Cain relit the wick, nodded. Then we'll be there first. Cole turned to Ruth. Can you guide us? I've waited 2 winters for this night, she said. I know every stone. They slipped from the shack, cloaked in darkness. On the red hill, thorns scraped Ruth's dress like ink scratches on parchment. Cain's stride was soundless, carrying the reek of leather and gunpowder. Below, the Devil's Creek whispered like a prayer unfinished. At the bank, they stopped. The water lay black and flat as a freshly whetted blade. Cole set his rifle, outlining the ambush. Ruth tucked the paper against her heart, listening to her pulse beat with the current. Cain's whisper was barely breath. By morning, we may be dead. If we die, Ruth replied, let it be with the truth on our lips. The name Elias Hart. Wind funneled up the gulch, carrying horse sweat and leather. In the distance, a string of torches swayed, like fallen stars dragging toward the creek. Cole tightened his grip. Dawn cracked like a thin blade across the ridge, its pale silver turning Devil's Creek into a whetted knife. Far torches flickered like falling stars, each flame beating like the heart of men riding toward judgment. Ruth pulled her black veil low, leaving only a sliver of steel in her gaze. Cain's calloused hand rested on the Colt, his head bent, as though praying to the only God he knew, gunpowder. The first hooves struck water. Between 2 mules swayed a locked iron chest. 3 riders flanked it, faces hidden beneath low-brimmed hats. Behind them, 2 more kept their carbines close. The wind carried sweat, gun oil, and the metallic tang of raw silver. Wait, Cole hissed. As the chest reached midstream, Cain snapped his fingers. Cole's Winchester roared like thunder, tearing the silence. One guard pitched from his saddle, splashing hard. Ruth rushed forward, her small pistol flaring twice, one shot snapping the chain, the other cutting a rein, throwing the mule off balance. Cain plunged into the freezing water, never flinching, Colt barking, dropping the last guard cold. Ruth knelt by the chest, hands numbed by water, but steady. Knife, she demanded. Cain tossed her his folding blade. She pried, veins rising in her wrist until the lock gave. Inside lay gray pouches stamped Silver Notch Mine, and 2 leather-bound ledgers. Cain flipped one open, eyes sweeping columns of names, debts, interest compounding like thorns tightening around throats. Ruth whispered, enough proof to choke him with his own numbers. Cole crawled down, turning to the last page. A wax seal, deep red, marked with EH inside a compass. Ruth's chest burned hot, the name searing her lips. Elias Hart, you have what belongs to me. I have what you want, a way out alive. Trade Ruth stepped to the ledge, holding the ledger high. Your name is here, your seal. Ink from your accountant's fingers stains the back. This morning the story has a name. The writers shifted uneasily. Hart studied her, lips curving. Ruth. The world pays not for courage, but for calculation. He raised his hand again. 4 prisoners were dragged forward, 3 Silver Notch miners and the pay clerk from last night. They knelt, trembling. Hart's tone was calm as scripture. I keep other numbers, living numbers. You hold my ledger, I hold yours. Trade? The creek wind stung with rust and water. Ruth leaned close to Cain. We don't have enough bullets. Enough for a crack in the door, he replied. She nodded, then walked forward, hands raised, veil flowing like black water. Hart drummed his glove against the saddle, signaling his men. Carbines tilted just slightly, enough for Cain to see the opening. His Colt flared, not at Hart nor his riders, but at the mule's reins. The beast reared, iron chest toppling with a crash like a funeral drum. Every rifle swung instinctively toward it. Now, Colt bellowed. The gorge erupted in fire. Smoke and bullets laced together like wire. Ruth darted through the haze, seizing the chest. A stray round ripped her veil, baring half her face, the ink-stained scar on her cheek flashing in dawn's light. Then came the roar, not of guns but of the earth itself. From upriver a wall of black water thundered down, the first flood of the season. Horses screamed, men shouted. Hart wheeled his stallion, his command swallowed in the roar. The flood roared through the canyon like the thunder of hell itself. A wall of black water foamed white, toppling shrieking horses, swallowing men and their gunfire, grinding all into froth. Ruth felt the ground quake beneath her, pebbles leaping like fish on dry stone. Cain clutched her, pressing her to the rock face, icy spray whipping her skin like lashes. Across the torrent, Hart's riders shattered like insects in a storm. Mounts bucked, men screamed, carbines clattered into the churning black. Steel glinted once before vanishing beneath the current. The flood drowned their cries until only its own music remained. Colt and his deputies fired at stragglers clawing for the banks, but their bullets were swallowed in the roar. One of the bound miners was wrenched into the current, the rope snapping taut before tearing free. Ruth lunged, fingers clawing the line, her eyes blazing with desperation. Cain yanked her back, growling, "If you go, you both drown." Ruth bit her lip until it bled. The rope slipped from her grip, carrying the limp body into the torrent. Pain cut her chest like a blade, but she did not falter. She pulled the black veil back down and whispered through ragged breath, "I'll settle this debt with the name that bought my husband's blood." Through the chaos, Elias Hart still sat astride his black stallion. Soaked to the bone yet unmoved, he was a statue carved of arrogance. He watched his men vanish with the cold detachment of an accountant balancing loss. When his eyes found Ruth, a thin smile crept across his lips. Not victory's smile, but the smirk of a lender collecting interest. Flood takes bodies, Hart's voice carried above the roar. But it won't take my books. They're in your hands, Ruth. And they're of blood. Cain smirked, lighting a damp cigarette, ember glowing red. Blood roads are the only roads I know. A figure rose from the muck, the mine's pay clerk, gagged, eyes wide with terror. Ruth strode over, ripped the rag free. He coughed, sputtering. He won't stop. Hart will send an army. Santa Fe's 5 days' ride. You'll never make it. Then you'll guide us, Ruth said flat, or die nameless in this mud. The man trembled, then nodded. Cain hauled him up, binding his wrists loose but tethering him to the reins. Cole muttered, 5 days. Hart could catch us in 3. We ride now. The sun climbed the ridge, bleeding red light across the canyon. Ruth looked at the pools of blood seeping into the mud, washed thin by the retreating current. It was Dust Valley's fate, lives swept away, erased. But this time she had a name, and she would carve it, not in ink, but in blood. The party rode from Devil's Creek. Hooves pounded like funeral drums through the hollow valley. Overhead, black crows circled and cawed, omens carried on their wings. Ruth never looked back. In her eyes, blood and flood had become one, and destiny lay only ahead. The road out of Devil's Creek was no road at all, just a knife edge of red sand still wet with flood and blood. 4 horses carried the survivors. Ruth in her torn black veil, Cain riding silent as an iron statue, Cole at the lead with the bearing of a war horse, and the trembling pay clerk tied to the reins behind. The sun climbed higher, laying streaks of light across the desert floor, each glimmer like frozen blood. Ruth pressed the soaked ledger to her chest, feeling its weight heavy as stone. It was no longer paper. It was bone. It was blood. It was the chain that bound her to Elias Hart. Cain pulled his reins tight, scanning the horizon with slate-gray eyes. He won't let go, he rasped. We got 2 choices, run faster or shoot faster. And which do you choose? Ruth asked, her voice steady through the tattered veil. Cain smirked, smoke curling from his lips. I ain't never learned to run. Cole cut in, voice hard. If it's guns alone, we'll die here. Hart's got an army. But Santa Fe has law, and law is the one thing he can't strangle forever. We live to carry that book there. Before the words died, dust rose at the far end of the trail. Riders in black swept forward, carbines glinting like teeth in the sun. Ruth clutched the ledger, her heart hammering like war drums. The wind carried a long whistle, the signal of pursuit. Cain drew his Colt, eyes flashing like a cornered wolf. He's already closing the net. They wheeled hard into a narrow ravine, hooves clattering, dust choking. Cole's Winchester cracked, scattering the first pursuers. Ruth bent low in the saddle, her veil whipping like the wings of a crow. She did not think of fear, only of Hart's name, carved into the pages pressed to her. Stepped beside Ruth, Colt steady, his eyes hard as winter frost. Cole set his back to the rock, Winchester cocked with a click. The 3 of them breathed together, like worshippers at the altar of death. Wind screamed through the canyon. Dust spiraled like smoke from an unseen fire. Somewhere in the distance, a lone rooster crowed, announcing dawn. But here, Beneath the cliffs, darkness clung like a shroud. Cain smirked, whispering, "It's time." And their fingers tightened on the triggers.